So I'll just basically open this with a bit of background, and then I'm going to just take a back seat and just basically chair and let the discussion happen, really. But I want to give some context to where this came from. So over the recent years, there's been a group of international group of eye tracking researchers developing methods publishing guidelines. So what should be republished, or what should be reported in a published research study. And as part of that discussion, there's been quite a few clinicians who've expressed an interest in having a kind of universal standardized set of protocols for clinical eye tracking. Now, obviously, clinical eye tracking is a very broad thing. There's a lot of subdisciplines within that. So there's a lot of discussion that's potentially going to be had within that. So that's the purpose of this meeting. We've tried to publicize it as widely as we can across any existing societies, mailing lists, etc. Anything anyone had proposed, we've tried to send it out there. So hopefully you've heard about this through multiple channels. So far, completely tenuous, completely basically suggesting the name of the International Society for Clinical Eye Tracking, if this goes ahead at all. That is, some of you will recognize that as being modeled on the International Society for Clinical Electrophysiology of Vision, which is ISCET. And we're joined today by Ruth Hamilton, who's president for ISCET, who's going to give a bit of context as to how that has helped the cause of clinical electrophysiology. So there's quite a few open questions to answer here. So first of all, do we require standard protocols for clinical eye tracking? And I'll go into more detail as to what we mean by those as well. If they are needed, then which disciplines are actually going to benefit from those? And then within those disciplines, which types of eye tracking examinations would benefit from standardized protocols? And we should acknowledge that there is already existing guidance out there for a number of different tests within a number of different subdisciplines. So are they sufficient? Do they need updating? Do they need some kind of body to provide some structure to that? You know what I mean? Like one thing obviously which would be important would be how would we actually structure a body, a standards body such as this. So far, because it's what we know, we've suggested ISEF as a precedent, but there are any other suggestions will be welcome, and this can happen any way that it wishes. And this is the important thing, really. For something like this to work, it needs to have buy-in from the entire community. And so my view is that for this sort of thing to work, it needs to be completely decentralized. Nobody's in charge, everybody's in charge at the same time. How you make that work, we'll be asking towards the end of the meeting for how, if we do decide to go ahead with this, how to arrange future meetings. I wouldn't want to be chairing every meeting. I'd rather have it be something which everyone gets to be involved in, so nobody is really leading it. The platform on which we meet, obviously being international, it would be nice to have it be done online as much as possible, but then maybe this requires in-person meetings. We have problems with timings, of course, because you can never include the entire world in a single meeting. So we may have to have different timings and so on. So a bit of thought into that would be maybe useful in today's meeting. If anyone has any suggestions for platforms that are neutral. I'm aware that the link we've sent today out is a Cardiff Zoom link. That's because that's what we're using at the moment from where I am, but this should be something that's decentralized as possible, really. So what we're going to talk about today, basically now I'm just giving a bit of background and scope. Then I'm going to invite Ruth Hamilton to give an overview of what ISEV does and how that might help to give some guidance as to how this might work. The big question is, does this society need to exist at all? Do we actually need an international society for clinical eye tracking? If the answer is no, then we can finish it just there. If the answer is yes, then we would need to come to some agreement as to which tests and which disciplines. Somebody's not muted. I'm going to suggest trying to mute if you can. Which clinical disciplines, which tests would benefit from guidance being published? As I said, we're going to need to work out how to structure future meetings, if any. In the event that we don't actually manage to come up with a clear plan today, then by default, I'll just arrange another meeting in 2 weeks' time in the same format. But hopefully we can come up with something between now and then. And then, of course, it would be good to arrange a second meeting at a time zone, in a time zone more suitable for the likes of Australia, New Zealand, China, Japan, etc. Because I'm aware that at least Larry Abel is here at 2 a.m. So that would be useful. Another thing which has been raised between when I first put this out and now is Zoe Kapula, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, has raised concerns about the term eye tracking and would like to discuss a little bit about whether we should be using some other term. So that's something we can look at as well. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of other things raised today as we go. So what do we mean by standards? At the moment, we've been talking about things like what would you do when you're making a recording of an eye tracking protocol? So that would, for an example, a ProCAD task, that would be how many target jumps are you going to have? How large should the target be? How big should the target, sorry, how large should the jumps be rather? How many different directions of targets are you going to have? That sort of thing. Now, a lot of different clinicians will already be doing this, and they'll be doing it in a perfectly fine way. The issue I think we have at the moment is that everyone does it in a slightly different way. And if we have a standardized protocol, then it gives you something to fall back on, almost like a default. The other thing we then have is how you actually analyze those data. So there are a number of small tweaks you can make to the way that you analyze data, and those small changes can have an impact on your results down the line. And if everyone's doing it in a slightly different way, then we aren't speaking the same language, essentially. So these parameters are likely to vary depending on the type of task that you're doing, depending on your individual discipline. Audiologists are going to have a different set of needs to a psychiatrist when they're doing different tasks. So we have to be aware of that. And this is likely to be, if it does go ahead, quite a large project with lots of different focus groups based on the different disciplines. So we'll have to work out how that may or may not be arranged. I'd like to just bring attention to the fact that there are already existing guidance documents out there. So to give some examples, there's an international anti-saccade protocol already. There's a standardized saccade protocol. There may be others that I've missed here as well. And then just at the Audiology Society, the British Audiology Society at least, have a vestibular protocol. And the question would be, you know, would ISCET be able to function to keep to be honest with you, would it be helpful to be able to promote those and have a central resource where these things can be identified? So I'm not going to weigh in on anything beyond this beginning part of the discussion, but I just want to simply lay out the case for and against clinical standards as I see it, and then we'll invite this out to anyone else. Can I ask Freya Mawat, would you be able to mute your audio? So a couple of things in favor of clinical standards. So at the moment, a patient tested at one clinical center would not be able to move to another clinical center necessarily and have the same continuity of care. So if we have standardization, then it would be possible potentially for patients to move between centers, and going forward, we're likely to see a lot more eye trackers in clinical practice. At the moment, it's quite a rare thing, really, for eye tracking to be in clinical practice. Expecting in the future that will change. The other thing, if we have standards available, then newcomers to the field may be able to refer to those to help them to decide what would be the appropriate task to use. Sorry,
sorry for interrupting.
Hello.
Hi. It's very difficult. I don't know if it's on.
Yeah, I can see that. Freya Mawat, would you mind? I can. Here we go. I've
so Matt, perhaps you can mute him. I think you can override and mute.
Yeah, I've done that now. I've just managed to mute her, so I think we're okay.
I think you can mute everybody actually as admins. Sometimes people.
Good idea, wouldn't it?
Thank you.
Work out how to.
Thank you.
How do I mute everyone at once? Well, we're okay at the moment. If I hear anyone else, I'll mute for now and I'll open up after this. So sorry, as I was saying, I know that certainly for ISEV, these defaults can serve as a good starting point for anybody who's new to the field. So by having a set of parameters, it can ensure that, or at least point people in the right direction to using something that's appropriate for the tools in their own clinical application. So that's one of the reasons for doing this. Reasons against, well, first of all, I mean, we don't want to simplify too much. Eye movement testing is a complex field, and you can't necessarily coerce everything into working, requiring the same battery of tests. I'm not sure if that would necessarily be the expectation here. It may be that different disciplines require things to be done in different ways. And then another thing to consider is that if you provide easy standards, easy guidance, then that potentially leads people to who maybe wouldn't fully understand how their instruments are working, maybe drawing inappropriate conclusions on the basis of data that they don't fully understand. So we also have to consider the arguments against having a clinical standardization. And I want to open this up as an open debate so we can think about the pros and cons of that. The last things I wanted to say before I pass over to Ruth was that Standards, I don't think there's any expectation, at least at this stage, that there would be any regulation as such, but rather it's a set of standards. So I mean, I can speaking from experience, designing a low pass filter for eye tracking data, I don't particularly have any bones about where exactly that lands, and it's nice to be able to refer back to a set of standards just to have something to as a starting point. So there would be defaults and things to go for if you have no particular reason to do things a different way. And then the other benefit, I think, to this society would be to be able to have a way of keeping them up to date as time goes on. To go to the example of the anti-saccade protocol, which I showed there, I understand that was that recommended doing anti-saccades in the horizontal axis only. And that was because at the time when that standard was developed, a lot of people were still using eye trackers, which didn't allow you to measure in 2 axes at once. And now, of course, that's the sort of thing that might benefit from an update nowadays. So that's all I wanted to say there. I'm going to pass over next to Ruth Hamilton, and I'll ask Ruth to provide a bit of some context from ISCET. So Ruth is the president of ISCET, and then we'll open up to general discussion. Thank you.
Hi all, can you hear me okay? Great, thanks. So thanks, Matt, for asking me along to speak. I should say, slightly in my defence, that I do a bit of eye tracking as well, but only in a research context. And I can see 2 people on the call I need to thank for guiding me with bits. That's Ravi and Shan. And also hi to Elizabeth from Waterloo in Canada, who's collaborated with us in our eye movement recordings. But this is much more about what ISCET has done. So ISCET, as a clinical society, was founded in 1958. And in fact, although it took us until the 80s to produce our first published standard, it was one of the founding principles that we should be working on ways of standardizing our tests. And in fact, everything that Matt has already highlighted as problems or barriers in the way of coming to international standards or guidelines applied to us. There were people who did this the X way in Japan, and then there was someone else who did it a different way in the States. And I can tell you that we now have 5 standards for the different areas that we assess. And every one of them, every change or every agreed sentence came as a result of long fought and occasionally bitterly fought ways of resolving the differences that were out there. One extra thing that ISCET has, which really helps us, is we have our own journal. So we have our journal Documenta Ophthalmologica, which is a Springer journal, Springer Nature journal, and we get to publish our standards and guidelines in there. They don't go through peer review because they're produced by a peer review process as such. But the other arrangement we have with the journal is that they're all available open access, and that makes accessibility to them really easy, and that's a really important issue for us. So the way they generally evolve is we had core tests that were always going to require their own standard, and they're probably still our kind of main grade A test is the electroretinogram. So it got its standard first. But most of the additional ones began life as a guideline, which just allowed you a little bit more flexibility in what you were saying and what needed to be done. To develop on them, we tend to do I guess it's a kind of formalized Delphi process. So a committee is appointed, and it's appointed quite deliberately to reflect the makeup of ISCET as a society. So therefore, it will include ophthalmologists, scientists, technicians, and the manufacturer's input is sought at a very early stage. And it goes through a fairly standardized process. We like a certain layout, we like a certain introduction that lets us say, here's what the test can be for, and here are the limitations of it, and so on and so forth. The drafts get scrutinized by the whole membership of the society, and that can be a long and drawn out process. There's lots of contributions come in, and all of those are taken on board. And finally, the publication is subject to a vote of approval by the whole membership. So I've written here in my notes, and I was thinking about how to describe all this. Vigorous debate is a hallmark of standard developments and updates. And I really mean that it is sometimes very difficult for individuals involved to come to a consensus. But what I would say is the advantages when you've been able to do that are fantastic. So there is absolutely no doubt that creating a standard is good for your patients. It's just astonishingly good for our patients. We tested this one year in the UK. We sent 2 people around 15 different electrophysiology centres to get their ERGs measured. And we looked at the variability between the 15 centres, all of whom are following the ISCET standard. The coefficient of variation was less than 7%. You don't get that in a biochemical assay. So evidence is there of just how well they work. And it means, for example, if a patient is tested in Aylesbury first time round and moves to Aberdeen for continued monitoring, you just carry on. You can do the same thing. So that makes it very valuable. Or if a patient moves from somewhere else and it's a new clinician looking at their results, they can trust the results that have been done elsewhere to the same standard. The second way in which this gives us an enormous advantage, and that then applies to our patients, is because when you develop a standard and publish it with techniques the way ISCET has used it, it becomes an industry standard. And that means that the manufacturers can use it as precedent case when they're undergoing the really stringent regulatory requirements of them, when they're making adaptations to their equipment or making new equipment and so on. So the fact that such a standard exists is really important for the way that they operate. It's probably important to say that standards really, the way we describe them in ISCET, standards define a minimum protocol. So we see it as the core of the tests that need to be done. We recognize in every single one that in many, many cases, people will want to go beyond that set of 4 tests. And if they do go beyond them, they may do them differently in different centres. So I think Matt had earlier referred to a default. So I don't know whether the core means the same to you as default. I think core would be the term that we would use. If there's, 4 or 5 things that need to be done and need to be done identically wherever you're doing them, you would call that your core test and you would write your standard about that. If there are additional things that may be indicated in some populations but less indicated in other populations, ISCET deals with those via a process we call extended protocols. And we invite our members to submit extended protocols. They are not nailed down to you shall do it this way, this way, this way, but rather reflect here is what's going on in general practice across the world with the people that are choosing to do this particular extension to the core testing that's described by the standard. And eventually, extended protocols can make their way into guidelines and perhaps even become part of a standard. So this is what gives us the certain flexibility. So the last thing that I wanted to say was just about ISCET in general, because I can see electrophysiology colleagues on the screen. It's nice to see some familiar names. And lots of our members do have expertise beyond electrophysiology, for example, in ophthalmic imaging or psychophysical testing, pupillometry, and clinical eye tracking as well. And ISCET recently partnered with the Imaging and Perimetry Society, and we're in the process of co-developing with that society a clinical guideline for the full field stimulus threshold test. So that's a psychophysical test that uses electrophysiology equipment. So this is a partnership that's allowing our society to move more generally into evaluation of vision rather than just electrophysiology. Anyway, I hope that helps you as a bit of a background about how an allied society has gone about doing this, and I'm really happy to answer any questions that people have.
If not, then I guess we'll invite now just general discussion. Anyone have any thoughts about the pros or cons of forming a society such as this, and also just a discussion really then about the types of disciplines that may or may not be covered. If anyone has any things they'd like to bring up, no, please just go ahead. I see Elizabeth Irving. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Well, the one thing that I wanted to mention is that not all eye trackers, and I understand that Dr. Kabula doesn't even want to call them eye trackers, are created equal. And I think if you're going to have standards, you're going to have to start right at the beginning and decide, well, what eye tracking devices are actually acceptable. Because none of those protocols matter if you're spitting out garbage in the first place.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I suppose we could also define: are we talking about using devices at all? I think generally we're expecting this is something that requires some kind of device, but we could be talking about search calls. We could be talking about EOG, and I think this is one of the things we just have to discuss between ourselves and come to some conclusions on. I certainly wouldn't expect we want to be nailing down a particular brand or anything like that, because that could be quite restrictive. Anyone else?
Matt?
Larry, yes.
Two things. One, I'm not sure very many eye trackers are actually certified for clinical use. I know the ICCAM is, and probably some of the other vestibular-oriented ones. But for instance, iLink, SR Research, I don't believe certifies any of theirs. My other question is nystagmus going to be brought under this rubric, or do we continue all to do our own things on that?
So in response to that, you're absolutely right. I've spoken to some manufacturers about this, and at the moment they say that the case is hard to make for certification for medical use because there isn't an apparent need for it, and so you have clinicians using them perhaps off-label, and perhaps one of the benefits of a society such as this would be able to provide that voice and say, hey, look, we're here. We would like to see these things made certificated for use. The second thing is absolutely, I mean, as a fellow nystagmus researcher, I would love to see this sort of thing being able to, to help people with nystagmus as well. And I guess we're going to have to look at what interest there is amongst this. How many audiologists do we have? How many psychiatrists do we have? And where is the appetite for creating those standards? Whereas if people are happy with what they already have, then those disciplines may want to see where they are. Yeah.
Fair enough.
And please, anyone else who would like to weigh in on the answers on these questions, please go ahead as well. Does anyone else like to raise anything? Feel free to put your hand up or there we go, Ruth.
Hi, yeah, just again, from ISCET perspective, we are scrupulous about being manufacturer agnostic. For this to work, you need your manufacturers on site. And therefore, standards have to be designed in such a way, and trust me, the manufacturers work extremely hard to comply with this, so that they can market their products as ISCET compliant. It's up to the user always. It's absolutely beholden on the user to make sure that that is true, but the manufacturers come on board. So that's really important. And just to add that I'm very interested in nystagmus monitoring too, and would love that to be one of the topics that was handled.
Thank you. Denise, is that Denise Atan? It is. Hi.
Sorry, I'll unmute myself. Yeah, I was just wondering whether there are any standards used for VNG within the ENT fields that we could sort of expand on and also copy slightly.
I'm not familiar with any, but I mean, we've got a good range of expertise here. Is anyone? We're talking about video nystagmography, presumably. So you're talking about typical. Are we talking about the vestibular type disorders, or for infantile nystagmus, the congenital types? Or
well, obviously it's used for vestibular disorders, but the technology is very similar. Apart from they're using sort of eye-mounted eye tracking, but they're looking at smooth pursuit. They're looking at nystagmus. The technology is quite similar, and that's a clinical test that's already in the clinical sort of environment. And there are different manufacturers that make VNG devices. And so perhaps we could learn something from that.
Quite possibly, yeah. Viral.
Yeah. Hey, how you doing? Enjoyed the talk. Ruth, I had a couple questions. With ISCET, I was part of the group earlier. Just with COVID, I've not been my annual fees, but I'm here at Cincinnati Children's Hospital in the United States, and with ISCET and electrophysiology, you had a clinical paradigm, which is the retinal dystrophy, or something that you specifically based the consistent response example you gave it, and we had 15 places in the UK, and they were very clear and very reliable in terms of reporting. In this sort of paradigm, I feel like we should and nystagmus, I do a lot of nystagmus too. I think a lot of the people here seems like they're interested in nystagmus. I mean, I feel like we need a clinical this to be a valid, there should be a single, or not a single, but at least a motility, a clinical pathology that we should be focused on, at least where we can see enough that we can sort of validate it in some way or form, or reliably test it, and that we all see enough of it, or at least the people who are really interested in moving forward. And I think it's a great concept. I just want to say, thanks for presenting it, Matt. And I think where I see the strengths in ISCET, I think this would be a very fruitful endeavor in terms of sort of stratifying and really getting down to a reliable method. But I think we sort of have to start back with a clinical scenario, which we all commonly see, that we can actually then figure out, what things we need to reliably, from a clinical standpoint. I'm a pediatric neuro-ophthalmologist, so I see nystagmus brand new 4 or 5 times a day. So the other component that concerns me is eye motility with regards to head position, and because you're going to get different recordings or readings depending on where the fixation target is and how you're relaying. So I feel like there's much more than just, and I think the main question that was I think Melissa or Elizabeth brought up was the machines that people use. I understand, and same thing with ISF, you can't really say what machine, and understand being commercially free from endorsing anything, but I really do think that those are all important questions that sort of, you need to have some paradigm of consensus of what each eye tracker can potentially do, like vertical versus horizontal, as you mentioned, Matt, and when you start to create this standardized consensus.
Right. Amanda.
I want to echo that. I think that there needs to be, and I'm wondering if guidance is probably a better term for that. When we're thinking about the different categories of eye tracker, I definitely agree they all need to be manufacturer independent, but depending on what sort of eye tracking you want to do, there's a range of different trackers that would manage different pieces. So perhaps for each particular, say, if we said, hey, it's horizontal prosocards, it needs to be X amount of hertz because we're going to have X latency, or if you use such and such a latency, here's the range that you are likely to then be reliable within, or some sort of, I think it's more guidance rather than a minimum standards for something like that. But I do definitely see the utility in having standards for, or sort of minimum core pieces that you put together for all of these. So thank you very much for bringing this up, Matt.
Okay, so a couple of points I'm hearing then is that, first of all, obviously, guidance, not standards, might be a better term at this stage. Also, perhaps, we should focus on a particular disorder in the first instance, maybe nystagmus or something like that. Obviously, when this meeting was arranged in response to a number of clinicians asking if this could be set up, and I didn't want to kind of constrain it in any way in the initial format. I don't know if maybe Ruth can comment on you've got your hand up there, about how ISEF has approached this, because it's such a broad thing, and because I'm guessing there's more uses for eye trackers than there really necessarily was or is for the clinical electrophysiology side of things.
You may be right there, and I don't pretend to be expert. So the point that Viral made, and Viral, welcome back anytime. Subs are very generous, they're only $50, I think, should know that off the top of my head. Anyway, so what happened with ISEF when the first standard actually came to fruition, we talked about doing these for a long time, but then we partnered with the Foundation Fighting Blindness, because we were so generally realizing what a key test the ERG was in retinitis pigmentosa. So, so it was the Retinitis Pigmentosa Society. So that became our trigger for action. And what we had talked about for a long time actually turned into something concrete and usable. And then, of course, it wasn't an awful lot longer after that where people began to realize the utility of the visual evoked potential when you were looking for demyelinating disorders, multiple sclerosis, and so on. And so that was a big driver behind bringing out a guideline, which then turned into a standard for VEPs. So, the point that was made by Amanda, I think, about starting with a guideline, which can then develop into a standard, I think is probably well made. and that's the path that we've used in the past.
Okay. We've got a comment here from Alcafiades, the ISIS, suggesting, I wonder if the standards would include any post-processing analysis criteria. Data from most manufacturers is analyzed employing in-house software that people may not have access to. And I think this was another of the reasons for potentially raising that it is helpful to have this. During the work that some of us have been doing on developing methods reporting guidelines for research, it's become apparent that yes, some eye trackers almost operate like a black box. You don't really know what it's doing. You send your data in and you get real conclusions out, but we don't really know what's going on. And so by making those by encouraging people to report more accurately what they're actually doing in the research, hopefully we'll get more access from the manufacturers as to what they're actually doing as well in terms of their analyses. And I would hope that the same would be done here. I mean, if we could say that we need to have the following steps done in your post-processing, you know, this is how you detect a blink, this is how you detect a saccade, how you're calculating velocity or low pass filtering, then, you know, the manufacturers would then be encouraged to use those rather than hiding from us the methods that they're using. And, you know, if you don't know how data is being processed, then I think that's potentially problematic. Okay, right. Does anyone have anything else they want to raise at this point? No. Okay. So do we want to have, do we feel any more information is needed at this stage? Katja.
Hello, thank you for organizing this meeting. My name is Katja Ripamonti. I'm from Cambridge Research Systems. One of the products we make is eye trackers. So I'm here to learn from this discussion. So I just wanted to mention that it would be great for manufacturers to receive specifications, so standards, as you call them. However, don't make them too strict and do involve manufacturers because sometimes there's a temptation in specifying too much, which restricts feasibility from a design and manufacturing point of view. But definitely your specifications would be very well received. Secondly, you mentioned making it open for users to access the processing. And this can be obviously done. However, sometimes requirements for clinical devices is that users should not have access to information or being able to manipulate the processing going behind the scenes. So sometimes it's not intentional from the manufacturer not to disclose information, but sometimes it's a requirement of a clinical device not to be able to be changed, so that when you collect data, you can be sure that not the operator hasn't inadvertently changed something. So it's in some cases one of the requirements.
Okay, so Katja, I take the point about allowing for innovation and not being too stifling with any standards. I think
Yes.
hopefully Bush would agree.
And also make sure that innovation is taken into account, so standards are reviewed as technology evolves.
Yeah,
I think it's very difficult sometimes to outsource material in order to make the same product again and again. So nowadays it's becoming a big challenge to be able to rely on the same parts even after just a year. So allow that flexibility.
Yeah, I mean, eye tracking is rapidly evolving in terms of the technology. You know, many of us have got a sense of how we like to do it, but now, you know, we're getting new methods, even using AI to detect gaze position and so on, things which we hadn't thought about before. Regarding the manipulation of protocols, I suppose if a device was set up in such a way that it was ISCET compliant or whatever you want to call that, then you wouldn't necessarily need to allow the user to tweak every individual setting. It would just simply be you know, this is the ISCET compliant setting, for example. So I wonder if that would be a problem if it was, as you say, the user isn't able to change it from a particular way.
Yeah. And in general, manufacturers should disclose and do disclose information about how data are handled and processed. Yeah. So I don't think there's no IP or copyrights, if you like, So that it wouldn't be a problem for a manufacturer to disclose how data are treated, whether it's for calculating mean, standard deviations, if that's what we are talking about.
Yeah.
It's just accessing the nitty-gritty of it. Might be difficult, but just to protect manipulation of the information.
Yeah. Ruth.
Okay. Can I say something?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Del.
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
not sure what your name is.
Zoe Kapula.
Zoe. Hello.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. As I wrote to you, I'm a little bit skeptical about and standardization and eye tracking. There might be problems in standardizing too much, and I see this obsession with standardization as something that might go against the other movements in the medicine, which is personalized medicine. I mean, if you deal with movements like saccades, there might be some stereotype trajectories over different humans, but that's not probably, it depends on what finition you are looking at. So I find it a little bit contradictory with the personalized medicine approach to try to standardize that much. And also to standardize the protocols, because you kill the creativity both of the clinical and the neuro and the science, and also the tracking term. For me, it's very really when this came first, that's probably 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It was something pejorative, a vulgarization of a very brilliant research field, the neuroscience of neurology of eye movements, and all suddenly we have tracking, eye tracking, which means what? And everybody can use it. And without even knowledge and the neurological basis of this. And so the question is, do we say, for instance, for EEG electrode brain tracking? Do we say for the heart tracking? We use other terms like electrocardiogram that refer to capture and analysis. So these are my anterior points I would like to exchange with you, and to see what the others think about that, because it's too beautiful and too rich to study eye movements, both clinically and in science, and we should not simplify that for anything in the world.
Thank you, Zoe. So, so that was one of the items for later, which we had on the agenda. Which thank you for raising that now, and we'll come back to that in a moment. I realise that Ruth already had the hand up, but we'll come back and discuss the 2 points. I think were around would standards stifle the creativity of the clinician, and secondly, the term eye tracking itself. Maybe I'll come back to you later just to ask what alternatives you would propose. Ruth, please go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, so I just wanted to say, yeah, I agree with the points that Katia has made, and also with Zoe. As far as ISCET is concerned, we've recognised right from the outset that engagement with manufacturers is really important. Proprietary software, for example, remains their business. They have different agenda from us, quite rightly, and we cannot expect that to be sacrificed on some altar which is determined by ISCET as a society and which is unworkable. So that has to be realised by both sides from the outset. As Zoe asked me in the chat separately, what are the limits of standardisation? Obviously, I can't speak for the eye tracking community, but I would say that that's up to you. If you set your limits so strictly that you've stifled creativity, then it's not working. But that's up to you as a society. I don't think creativity has been stifled in ISCET at all, far from it. The purpose of the standards was to lock down the smallest, most central core of tests, which we agreed by consensus were going to be universally important to our patients. and to ensure that's done well. One of the things that was happening in ISCET before we standardized was that with the best will in the world, you were seeing a gradual divergence of techniques across the world. And whilst that was great, and that still happens under many circumstances, it stopped the ability for us to allow our patients to be comparable from centre to centre, or for their disease to be understood the same way by a clinician in one place and by a clinician in another place. So I don't think ISCET's aim was ever to put such strict limits on standardization that we stifle creativity, and I don't think that has happened. But I understand the concern completely.
Great. Rasha. Okay. Oh, you seem to have frozen.
Okay.
We see you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I just want to stress that because the nystagmus topic was raised, and also that we're discussing the standardization and guidelines. So because I'm interested in people with low vision and rare diseases, and nystagmus actually is very many patients. So even whatever thing you want to study, the person can have nystagmus. And also this abnormal head posture, and maybe we call it in certain conditions, preferred head position. So while putting guidelines, it would be great to have this among the guidelines. I mean, not to, because sometimes there are these like specific people are kind of excluded or not there when we're putting the plans. Because, for example, you need a tracker with a certain specifications that would follow a rapid. So, for example, Hertz, it has to be following rapid, case, and taking like this, they call it the selection, the frequency, there is this term, the frame per second. So I mean, the tracker, while choosing the tracker, we have to like be aware of what we are wanting to study. It would be really great having guidelines. Like I don't mind using standards or guidelines or whatever term we agree, and I see that we will personalize, of course, with each person, but having guidelines and having this actually group is great, and I must have thanked you. In the beginning, because many of us it's not to be among the group. So thank you for this. I'm
not sure if everyone else has had the same experience, but I'm struggling to the signal quality is quite poor. We heard, I think, a lot of the initial aspects. If anyone, I'm assuming others have had the same difficulty. But Rasha, yeah, I think we've had a few people echoing the sentiment that that we would want something to describe, not to restrict equipment, but to provide minimum specifications for what would be appropriate for any given test, just to make sure that people are using at least something that's suitable, but without constraining to a particular manufacturer, etc. I'm afraid after that I missed the thrust of what you said.
Yes.
I think we can hear you better actually with your video off. Do you want to just repeat what it was you said at the end there?
Yes, like it's just 3 bulletins. Like if we can also put into consideration of people with nystagmus, abnormal head posture, or preferred head posture from the beginning, while putting this guidelines for the trackers. We don't have to say, for example, the brand, but if we say the specifications of the tracker that would be used has to have so and so, that will be great. Right. I think.
Good. Okay, good. And that seems to be same.
Thank you.
Okay, Vijay.
Hi, Matt. Thank you very much for organising this meeting. I agree with the standardisation, if you like, of protocols, and documentation really is key to have a set numbers of documentation, key points, so that the communities across the world, wherever patients decide to go, can get the same standards. I don't think it's going to stifle creativity. We all know what we're all doing. As a researcher, but also a clinician, I want to know what my patients are doing in Leicester, or if they're down in Southampton, for instance, or if they're seeing you in Cardiff. But what we don't know is that we sometimes get like waveforms for nystagmus patients, but we don't know how they would undertake and what distances. So having clear standards of documentation would be really key for me as a clinician. But in the research world, my creativity shouldn't be stifled by the clinical world, is the way I see it. Always trying to strive for the best for patients.
Absolutely. And actually the methods reporting standards, which we're hoping will be published in the first half of this year, it does exactly that. It doesn't prescribe how you should do things, but it simply says this is how you should report what you're doing. And hopefully that provides enough context to be able to replicate research. And obviously in clinics, it may be more appropriate to go down a route of guidance rather than just how you report things. Sian.
Yeah, I really wanted to echo what Vijay said. I couldn't agree any more strongly. In the clinical world, we're crying out for, exactly as ISCET does, to know that what we're seeing, these patients tend to go to a lot of different units. So we need to be able to compare our results, and compare things into center, and not just the recording parameters, but also how we've been analyzing it, what measures we're using, what clinical importance we're placing on that. So I think there's an absolutely desperate need from the clinical world, and I just couldn't agree any more strongly.
Okay. I've seen a few comments coming up in the chat, which I'll get to, but I just want to go back to Zoe, I think we've talked a bit about the creativity and making sure that clinicians are still free to do what they wish to do. And hopefully that's addressed by these being guidelines and standards to fall back to in the case of all other things being equal. But if you disagree, please let me know, or anyone else wants to raise anything. The other thing you pointed out, Zoe, was the use of the term eye tracking itself. And saying, we don't call it heart tracking, we don't call it brain tracking, and so why eye tracking? Was there an alternative that you had in mind? Is there a particular, what term would you use in that instance?
I don't know.
This is Zoe. Yes.
Well, we confuse the machine with the function, the physiology. So in the past, we were talking about video oculography, eye coil system, or there are other ways in describing a machine or a tool to record eye movements. But the eye tracking is a mixture of a term that refers at the same time of something that we can get and something that simplifies. We can track the eye to understand the brain, or it's for me, it's not, I would use video oculography. It's more, and this way, this refers only to the apparatus I'm using for recording something, but does not refer to other things.
Right. So I guess with if we're trying to truly international, we need to make sure that we're using something which is used across the world. And I'm aware video nystagmography is used, or video oculography is used in some parts of the world. Some places talk about ocular motricity. Can I just ask, Zoe, what is your discipline? Are you in ophthalmology or neurology, or what discipline do you work in?
I have no discipline because I spent all my life working on eye movements in the ophthalmology field, neurology field, developmental. So this is the beauty of eye movements, to be able to gather knowledge and to produce knowledge in different fields. But for me, the most important thing is that whatever the person is, clinician or a researcher, that there is some understanding and mastering of the neurology of eye movements, rather than using it as a tracker and having all this vulgarized simplification equation that you look there, the fixation is there, so the brain is there, and there are lots of simplifications that are not in correspondence with the discipline, the science behind this.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I think, at least the purpose of this meeting today is to talk about whether or not we need to actually have such a standards body, and we can take that forward to if we do have a future meeting to talk about how that would actually be labelled in the future. I'm seeing a comment from Fatima, presumably that's Fatima Shorkat, talking about the need to ensure that anything that's developed is appropriate for children, and obviously the paediatric populations are a big part of eye tracking in a lot of cases, not for everyone, but for a lot of people it is. So and I'm well aware that you can come up with these very rigorous standards, and then it's completely impossible to do in a pediatric or even in most clinical populations. Okay, I'm mindful that we've only got 10 minutes left, and I do want to make sure we keep to time. So one thing which I think I would just like to bring forward to this point is just some discussion of how we would arrange a future meeting. I would prefer that it was a decentralized thing. I don't want this to be, or personally, I wouldn't want this to be something which is seen as the effort of a specific group or individual driving the agenda. I think for something to be international, it needs to be owned by everyone. So either volunteers for taking on chairing of a future meeting, but also any comments around a decentralized platform, because I'm aware that even with Zoom, I've had to send out a link that has .cardiff in it, and I'd rather it was an open thing. Does anyone have any thoughts about how they would like to see that sort of thing be organized? Or even a recommendation of a platform that's truly neutral. And I'm aware we will organise a second meeting if necessary, if we go ahead with this, to include other parts of the world. Anyway, maybe we can have a think about that, and if anyone wants to drop me an email with suggestions afterwards, we can do that. Google, yeah, so Google Meet might be a way to do this actually, and it would just be a case of how we would arrange that. Okay, one critical thing, I think, hopefully we've had enough information now. I'm going to launch a poll to ask people in the meeting whether or not they feel that ISCET should exist. That's not saying the name will be ISCET, it's just simply saying, should a society exist to provide standardization or guidance or whatever it may be, and we'll have to agree on all that, but should this go forwards as an initiative? So I'm launching that poll now. It's just a simple yes, no question, which I appreciate is not as nuanced as maybe it could be, but okay, well, it's a clear yes then. Now we've gone well over half, and we've got 97% yes. So okay, fine. Well, that's good to know then. All right. So let me just check we haven't missed anything on the agenda then. So the other thing would be to arrange a meeting to suit time zones inclusive of Australia, New Zealand, China, and Japan. I'm very happy to go along to that to make sure that anything communicated from this meeting goes forward. I'm aware that Larry Abel is here from Australia. Is there anyone else who would like to potentially to chair such a meeting?
I'm also in Melbourne I work with Larry, so I'm also at 2:52 in the morning. And would really appreciate not being up this early, but equally if it moved, so similar to when we have meetings with the States, maybe if it was a moving time slot that perhaps is not brilliant for everyone, but is better, then that's sort of my thought on that.
Yeah. Larry, I see you've turned your camera on. How would you go ahead?
The trouble with Australia is we're really the outlier. If somebody in India would like to chair this, that might actually pick up a wider range of time zones, but I don't know if anybody there would like to put their hand up. Much as I love volunteering for things, I suppose I could do it from here, but like I said, that doesn't accommodate a lot of people given where we sit.
Okay.
But somebody in between might be good. Even China or Hong Kong, for that matter.
And of course, by default, most people here will be within the time zones that work for us at the moment. So maybe now the problem is at the moment, we don't have a specific mailing list or anything like that. This is a separate issue to everything else. So what I will do is I'll put some information on the website, and maybe I'll ask people to direct their colleagues to that website. And I feel like before moving forward with anything on this side, and I appreciate maybe a moving time slot would be the way to do this. We'd need to get some opinions from the China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, etc. side of things.
I know a group in Hong Kong that I don't think was aware of this.
Right.
So they might well be interested.
It's quite possible. I mean, we've basically taken all suggestions given to us, but naturally those are, the methods reporting group, although we aim to be international, it's mostly Europe and the United States. Yeah, as much as we can, we want to try and to get the word out. Okay. Any other thoughts then around organization? So I mean, in the absence of anyone else, Larry, would you be up for chairing a meeting? And I can dial in at whatever time is required and make sure I can communicate anything.
Yes, I think yeah, I can't say enthusiasm is overwhelming, but yeah, I could do that.
We'll maybe if we communicate, I'll make a write up on the website, and then if anyone else wants to do it, perhaps based in India, and I'll make the recording available as well, then we can do that. And this would just be to ask the same questions again, just to see what, because obviously there seems to have been an overwhelming yes here. That may be a selection bias, of course, yeah, okay, that's good. Right, so I'm just going to come back to some of the comments, but while we've got a bit of time left that have come up in the chat. So there was questions around should things like the display specification and should the monitor or display specifications be included in such a guideline? I mean, it's not for me to decide that. If that seems like something that's suitable, and it may well be, then that would be something that would be under the remit. Am I right, Ruth, that the ISCET standards are very clear on display and that sort of thing? Sorry, I'm jumping.
No, you're fine. Yes, you're correct on that. So, but we don't lock everything down. So we would say, for example, for doing a VP, you need a field size which is at least 15 degrees or something like that. I hope I've got that right. So these are absolutely minimal standard. And for example, if you're testing pediatrics, I think Fatima made this point very appropriately. Basically, all the standards say when you test pediatrics, it's a different game, and all acceptable modifications are understood.
Yeah. Okay. Flores, hello.
Thanks for organizing this. It's been brilliant. Since I know you've been trying to do something like that. So yeah, that's great. But I just wanted to echo what Ruth was saying, and also what has been said on the chat regarding the pediatrics. It's a big issue. And I think that the point here, or the main point of this discussion, was focus on nystagmus. And of course, nystagmus is really important, but I think there is a real lack of standards for pediatrics. So yeah, I would be quite keen to help in developing these, or working towards some sort of model to support these patients, but also considering that not all the patients that we conduct eye tracking are patients with nystagmus, and therefore there's a range of patients with more or less cognitive abilities or even physical abilities that we should be taking into account for this. So I'm very keen on this sort of core standard or core protocol, and then perhaps add-ons that would be more suitable for children, more suitable for people with cognitive impairments, more suitable for X, Y, and Z. And yeah, I think that would be really, really good for clinics. And in terms of research, then anyone can really do whatever they want in research in a way or other. So I don't think that would hinder creativity at all. But yeah, I just wanted to shout out for the pediatric area side of things. But thanks again for organizing this, and very, very exciting to hear all the ideas.
Thank you. Viral.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also going to echo what Flores just said, because I'm a pediatric, person as well. And that's the population I see significantly. I know the difference with ISCET, as Ruth had mentioned before, it's been standardized for adults, and then there's like, asterisks in the sense of when you're doing pediatrics and making optimal suggestions for pediatric, cutting down the time and the scotopic, session. So I think it'll be valuable. I think it goes back to figuring out what we want to look at clinically and making a list. And Flores, and the point is, pediatrics, it's not just nystagmus. We have CVI. We have other many other reasons. Vestibular reasons that I see in kids here. In my neuro-ophthalmology clinic, outside nystagmus and CVI, and I could probably name another 10 other reasons why we could look at motility, sort of neuromuscular disorders and genetics reasons that we see in children. So having that overall some guidelines instead of a standard, or with guidelines, kind of like ISCET, I think it would be good at the basis to get clinical information. And then I can tell you one concern previously mentioned, and Ruth I've never found as a clinician that the ISEF standardization has ever blocked me creativity for if I need to do extra sequences or do more or do a different test altogether, right? In terms of the protocol. So I think having that backbone would be great starting point from a clinical standpoint, especially if you're transferring care for patients. But then your creativity, you can figure out, at that time point, what's needed and customizing it and catering it to the patient at need. But I think if you start off with a groundwork of what clinical things are people seeing and what things would be ideal to address, then I think you could start to design a format,
Thank
Okay.
you. I would just because we're at the hour, I'm not going to shut this down at this point just because we've got to the hour. So, but just to give some context as to where we go forwards, what I will do on the website is I'll create a form so that people can send me email addresses so I can populate an emailing list for this. As I said, it'd be really helpful if anyone wanted to volunteer to be a rotating chair on this so that it is a truly collaborative community effort. That would be great. And then we can, pass this between ourselves. So yeah, so look at the website at the end. Let me just send you the link because I know some people will need to leave now perhaps to get to other meetings. So this is where it's hosted at the moment. Keep an eye on that. By the end of tomorrow, I will make sure that I've got some information on here, the video and so on hosted. So you can point people to that and you can sign up via that. So I won't stop this just because we've got to the hour, but I appreciate some people will need to go. Larry. Oh, we'll unmute you first. There you go. Oh, sorry, I think we're both pressing the button at the same time. Hopefully you can, there you go, sorry.
Yeah, couple of things. Amanda and I are both working at the air show tomorrow, so we have to be up again soon. But I think one reason for minimum standards for a lot of this is I'm seeing more and more phone apps appearing that will magically assess all manner of things. And these are often being marketed really enthusiastically. And eye trackers are a black box. Phones are even more a black box. So I think having some sort of standards will help avoid those being misused. And the other is, I notice almost all the companies that make these things call them eye trackers. So while it may be restrictive, I think that's a term that's fairly well established. And I don't think it's that problematic. And yes, I will. I can share an Asia Pacific oriented next one if needed. But
okay,
I would say.
Can I say something last?
Go ahead. Yes.
I'm very glad that after our discussion, the word creativity was repeated more than 50 times. And so even if you are doing tracking, perhaps the most important thing is the creativity. And creativity is based also in deep knowledge. And sometimes it's difficult to find the frontier between we need standardization and automaticity because we don't master the things. And if we master, we don't need that much guidelines and everything, right? Thank you very much.
So one thing to consider is, of course, the people who are entering the field, and there's likely to be an influx of people as the technology becomes more available. So I wonder whether the people that would benefit from this endeavor probably the most initially would be the new clinicians entering the field, giving them some kind of structure, and then ultimately the patients hopefully would benefit too. That's my thought on that anyway. Does anyone want to raise anything else? I don't see any more questions unless I've missed something in the chat. Ruth.
Just one last quick thing. If you form a society, which seems there's a lot of enthusiasm for, then there's nothing like face-to-face for making these things easier to smooth through and work out. And just a final urge, don't make the same mistakes as ISEF. Please don't fall out with one another about the things you don't agree about. You all want the same thing in the end, which is better care for patients. So there'll be strongly held feelings, and it's working through those that matter most.
Great. Okay, all right. In the absence of any other questions on here, then I will go away and try and summarize what's been said today. Please consider if you would like to host a future meeting so that this is a truly collaborative thing. And yeah, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate everyone's time for doing this. Thank you. All right, we'll leave it there. Cheers. Bye-bye.